Well, welcome. This is an outstanding submission that I think we can learn from, and we're going to go through it and break it up and pause in each part, so you can pause the video and go through and say this is where this will be a high level met in all areas. So first of all, we've got a mandatory inclusion of is required in terms of your cover sheet and going through. Table of contents is always very useful for the reader. Can I say a little critique on this one? It does not perhaps to be that elaborative, and it chews up a few pages. However, those headings and few key points is what's required, and you could probably contract that a little bit. The other mandatory including is the context statement, and it's got lots of information. It's got socioeconomics, and they get that information from school and my school site website. It talks about its framework of what it's going to be learning from and what year levels, etc. This is obviously going years 7 to 10 English, and this is a part of your specialisation that you're doing. So let's go into the practice number 1 proper. Now in this we are looking for these things, so let's have a look and go through and say what are we looking for in terms of criteria in the scoring rubric. Collect and interpret a variety and a range of data for these purposes. Establishes the student's current level of performance. Use the official curriculum and identify opportunities, not necessarily of teaching them, but opportunities for general capabilities, including literacy and numeracy. So we've got to see whether that is going to be met by what is in the task. So let's go through. So first of all, using the headings that are applicable to each criteria. So it's data analysis. So there's a general statement about the whole data and purpose of data, and notice, for example, I'll highlight that we have academic justification throughout the document. In other words, it's not just a person's recount or feelings, it's actually justifiable, it's evidence-based. The whole class, qualitative data, and that's from observation data that they're doing, and quantitative data. So they've got the range of data there. So I'm seeing serious data. Here's what data did they use? Results from previous semesters, distribution of grade represented in table and graphical forms. Then they talk about their focus students, and they've gone looking at learner profiles and interests, and they did a discussion with the mentor and a student survey. So that's some data collects what they have, and they've put those in tables, and that's the summary of those conversations and the student survey. Quantitative data, so then they look at their focus students and basically extracted from the whole class data their focus students. Work samples were collected as like a pre-test going forward, and here's some annotations on the work samples for each focus students, and you see some commentary over to the side here. And then it says, okay, student A, pseudonym John, they talk about, give some cognitive commentary for that, and therefore, and it says this paragraph, and it could be highlighted about proposed strategies, could be a sub paragraph here, but that's what they're going to do as in response to the data. 2 things that were fitting for John. For April, again, you see press repeat, cognitive commentary, discussing and analysing the data, and that's important to understand. This is an analytical report, therefore we need to see commentary and analysis, and we need to see that therefore. And furthermore, okay, there we go to do those things for them. That's the therefore statements that I'm seeing. Similarly for Rebecca, commentary, and a bit shorter, some therefore. Next, we're going to have a look at, well, did they do what was required? And the first 2 criteria were, okay, going forward, collect and interpret data. Yes, they interpreted it as well. Did they establish where the students were at? They had a pre-test, they had prior tests from previous semesters. Now we're looking for official curriculum and general capabilities. So I think they've ticked the box on the first 2 really clearly. Again, using the headings that are there. What have we got here? So we've got content descriptors, achievement standards. they've pulled it from the Australian curriculum. General capabilities, they've gone through and said these are the general capabilities that are going to be applicable to this unit, which will be taught continuously throughout. They've gone and just cut that off. Sorry, I'll just extend that. It is looking at, assessment pieces, official curriculum from QCAA, official rubrics they're using. Now, you don't always have to put the assessment things in, tools in. However, some people find that's an appropriate one to do. They then do the teaching and planning, and that section by itself would be sufficient. And they've talked about academic justification, how they're planning, so I'm seeing that throughout. It's analysing things. Then they're talking about, okay, so what's my teaching and learning plan for the week? And they've gone through what it is. So that seems, and you've got your content descriptors, you've got your sequence of learning. So they've translated the curriculum into a sequence of learning, which is what's required. And the last one is the mandatory table of all their data collects and how that fits together. So going back to the rubric, and I'll pause shortly, or suggest you pause to say, have they achieved? Well, I think they've done a very comprehensive job with the data and establishing what the students' current level of performance is and their readiness for learning. And they have concrete evidence of the official curriculum, and they've planned a connected sequence, teaching and learning sequences, and they've identified the general capabilities. Now, two things to start on from the planning from section number 1 is, or practice number 1, is we see academic justification throughout. We see evidence inserted with annotations, and I think this person could annotate a little bit more fulsomely, but you have evidenced, analytical discussions and academic justification are coming together here. So I'm feeling that they've really got a great handle on what they are now going to do into the teaching assessment areas. So this section sets you up, I believe, for the whole GTPA, and you need to spend a few bits of your word limit currency here. I think more than the 1,000 words, you might drift to 1,200 or a little bit more, because it's so important to get this right. Collect the data, analyse the data. Therefore, what are my anticipated teaching and learning strategies that I'm going to use, and rolling out from there. So pause the video now, and before we go on to plan section number 2. In section number 2, we're looking now at teaching, and similarly to the other models, well, let's have a look at the scoring rubric that we have. So the scoring rubric requires that they, let's get that central, excuse me, select and use a variety of, range of suitably challenging, engaging teaching and learning strategies, differentiated teaching, learning and strategies, teach the general capabilities, you have to evidence that, and make suitable adjustments based on ongoing data. So, I've encouraged people to maybe combine those two together, because there's overlap between a strategy, whether it's differentiated or not, as long as we have a range and we have differentiated learning. So let's go into this sample. So I like the idea, and this is the pattern I think you need to repeat, which I think most people find beneficial, is that you talk about your strategy, in this case goal setting. You give some academic description with academic justification. You give its examples with evidence. So you then describe it, justify it, give the example, and evidence it. And they've gone and said, well, what's the impact of that? So was it effective for that? That's probably a little bit skinny in terms of impact, and it probably could be more fulsomely described. But you've got that model. Here's the strategy, why I'm using this strategy, and what was its impact. And also you're looking for, and we'll see if we can find it in this example, where we're looking backwards and you're connecting the data. Now, in section number 1, you've already said, as they did the commentary on each focus student particularly and the class, they said they had a paragraph, what I call the therefore or in response to paragraph, where it says this, you're going to use these strategies. You forecast in section number 1 what you're going to do in teaching, and I should find those things in section number 2. Gradual release of responsibility, again, justification, so that's academics, description of it and examples of it. There's some written commentary of the example, and here's the evidence. So you're going to do press repeat with this. Word-wise, you could probably trim that and cut a page out, because you need to be beyond, around that 70 pages maximum. So again, demonstrating the impact. Describe, justify, give an example, evidence the example, and describe its impact for that. And you see that's now linking for that. So they are clearly in this impact linking it back to their focus students. And the purpose of the focus students is to be trackers or markers for your whole class. Now, your whole class benefits, but you're using your focus students to demonstrate that you are having a responsive, data-informed teaching methodology. Strategy number 3, again, models, justification, examples, evidence of it, and impact. Collaborative learning, justification, example, evidence, okay, and not impact. I can't see impact here, maybe that's a missing bit. Peer-to-peer assistance, justification, academic justification, example, evidence, impact. And that keeps going on. So this person's done multiple different examples of strategies which are both differentiated and a range of teaching strategies. So you see that throughout. Now, have they achieved what's required? So let's have a look at, let's refresh and remind ourselves about the scoring rubric that we're looking at here. They definitely have employed a range of challenging and engaging teaching strategies. The voice on differentiation could be slightly higher about how that's differentiated, but it has showing that the impact is meeting the learning needs. Now we're looking for teaching general capabilities, and have you made adjustments along the way in response to your data along the way. So in the moment decision making and goal setting. So this one here is, as per the booklet, the adjustment is an in the moment decision making, so that you are describing what you heard. Now this is not in the moment because all of a sudden we couldn't go to sport, or all of a sudden there was a power outage or something like this. It has to be not a school interruption, but in the moment decision making that talks about learning. So a learning decision in the moment. So you notice that and had a look at the learning goals and so on. At the end of the lesson, they reflected on this and they seemed happy. Great. I implemented a strategy in all lessons moving forward. So in other words, you tried a goal-setting activity in the moment. The students responded very well to it, and therefore I adopted this strategy thereafter. And she gave a moment, a small portion. And the second example that they have is at the beginning of this, she had noticed their capacity in this area. So she did a little task with them, and they recognised they weren't making connections with that. Therefore, she had produced a scaffolded resource for that. Now, plan between 2.4. I think she's got more than she needs here. Okay, you don't need all of these examples. Give us your best example, but that you need as an illustrative example. 1 or 2 is what we're looking for. We have 3 here. Again, I noticed students with that, therefore I created this. And this is not in the moment. This is a difference between planned and enacted teaching, and that probably could be actually utilised in another space in the task. But it's really clearly, it's evidenced. Now, general capabilities was the last one that they needed to look in this criteria, and you're looking here about, here is a worksheet, how I did this. detailed paragraphs, scaffolded, and so on. So it's evidenced, it's described, and it's evidenced. Now, does that match what was in section number 1, that you would identify how you would teach it? Section number 2, this is how I taught it. Yes, you have. So going back to the rubric, I believe they have done it well. They've had it provided a range of learning and teaching and learning strategies. They've didn't put it in the same order, but they've done the general capabilities. And ongoing student data and analysis, they've done that really clearly in the moment and subsequently. Probably could have given one less on that to save some space and utilise it elsewhere. But again, is it a met? Yes, it's highly met. Pause the video, have a look at any of the samples in your work and critique your work against that standard. Section number 3, let's remind ourselves of what we're looking for. So we're looking for a variety of assessment tools and whether it fit for purpose and inclusive and works. Feedback, really clear feedback to learners, okay, on a range of issues. And this, the last two, are the moderation of your summative task, where you've assessed it and made judgments and you've moderated that. Looking at your booklet, you'll see that you need to have a cognitive commentary, and it specifies the range of work samples that you need to do. And the rule of thumb is that you use your focus students is the minimum requirement of the range of samples that you would use, and to provide commentary and marking and moderation. Let's go through here. So we're looking for a range of assessment. So I've got formative, okay, and talked about inclusive practice, great, so you're hitting the mark in terms of that criteria. And assessment for learning approach, so they're talking about an approach where assessment is embedded in their learning, and it's good conceptually to see that. So what were the actual formative assessments? Observations, answers from learning activities, work samples, Kahoot quizzes, concept recycling. I would activate and ask review questions, so that's more of a qualitative learning goal. And at the end of the lesson, like an exit, they did that, and perhaps an exit card would be here. I can statement 1, this is again assessing in the lesson how they're progressing, individual work samples going forward, and this is demonstrating really clearly the feedback that you have. And you can do that through scanning your own written feedback, or in this case it was digitally provided. So that's a range of assessment. Summative task going forward, feedback again, examples, concrete examples. So have they had a range of assessment? It was formative and summative, and they provided feedback. Now it's really clear you need to provide written feedback. Now this has been mixed in a little bit in terms of the criteria, because the right have felt that expressed the narrative, the analytical narrative better. I would recommend that if you're not as confident in that area, that you stick with the script in terms of each area. Now going forward, towards the end, we're now going to look at the summative task and whether you made judgments against a rubric, cognitive commentary, and the mandated forms of moderation. So let's have a look at this. Here it is. They've described the fit for purpose, which is one part of the criteria, and here's the feedback that they've given on the summative task, and they've used annotations to advantage. Here's the rubric and a cognitive commentary. The easiest way to do a cognitive commentary, what the person has done well, what the person's weaknesses are, and is there any improvements that you would recommend. And you notice here that they've used that format. Strengths were, challenges were, or limitations, and how to improve. So that gives, and it should in some sense reflect the language of the criteria. In other words, if you're looking for listening, speaking, and creating, where you'll describe those things in your cognitive commentary. And again, student B, press repeat, feedback, judgment, rubric, cognitive commentary for April, and Rebecca similarly. So it's really clear, it's really logically that you've done those things. You've made professional judgments, you've used official curriculum to do it, and you've given some justification through a cognitive commentary for your decision making. Now, the mandatory inclusion now is that moderation. And I think assessment section is an easy section because you just do what you need to do as per criteria, and that you have some moderation. Here's the teacher, here's you. There's a number of questions that you need to answer. And I would think that's slightly, if I was being critical, that's slightly underdone. In other words, if your moderation does not differ from your teacher, you don't just say it didn't differ. You tell us why it was an A. They were exactly the same because student XYZ provided a high degree of boom, 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 listing the areas from your cognitive commentary. But that's at a basic but sound level of moderation, and you see that it's gone through. So I would be, if I was being critical, a little bit more elaborative would be there. And here is the whole class results and identification. Probably not necessarily required as an extra, is that section there, but that's included to add some more detail for that. Again, pause your video and have a look at what's being required, and I think you'll see that this person has a variety of assessment tools, they've provided feedback, they've made judgment on a summative task, and they have engaged in moderation. Section number 4, reflection. And I want to, before I go into this, is you've really got to, and this is answer the question that's being asked. You've asked to describe the scope and sufficiency of data and ongoing data. They identify and describe the difference between planned and enacted teaching, and importantly, the pedagogical reasoning. Now, we saw some of that in the earlier section, and I suggest that that earlier section 1 and section number 2 probably best lies here. So it's talk about your data, talk about your teaching, and this one here is your teaching and assessment. So you can notice that this is really doing describe and critically reflect on section number 1, describe and critically reflect on section number 2, describe and critically reflect, and I'm using the word critically here, section number 3. And then you say, you put yourself in the role of a continuing teacher and say, what would you do? Now you notice these keywords: relevant theory, pedagogical reasoning, okay, and this term called next step, informing next step. So it's all about, it's not a recount, it's a reflection which has an analytical, higher order thinking involved. So ensure that your reflection is doing those things. So, adequacy of additional data, whole class, learn, focus students, etc. So I'm going to see, I don't just want to see it's listed because I've already got that. I want to know whether it was any good. Was it the scope and sufficiency? So I'm looking for that language for that. Gave me insights. That's more higher order. Generation required concrete, so I ensured that. It enabled me to review. I assured that. It's provided opportunity. So it's got a degree of an analytical thought. It's still a little bit too recounty for me. I collected that. It gave me insights. They proved invaluable because, great, I'm now saying it's good, proved useful. I was aware that they needed more. So my answer here, and ongoing data, was that was provided an example of how that data was useful for that. This had various implications that's being applied, so it's not a recount, it's actually saying, okay, this is how I used it. The whole class, again, they're not accustomed to that, so it gave me insights, it gave me something to in response to. So I'm seeing this here of, have I described the data? Yes. And the simple data narrative, if you wanted to condense some of this more elaborative nature that this person has done, is that you need to say what was working well, what didn't work as well as you thought, and what else would you put into the mix. So it's pluses, minuses, and something interesting. PMI on your data collection is a way to go forward, and perhaps as an ongoing framework for this. Next step teaching was that came into this. So if I was to continue, two main things I would do. And I would do this, for example, and she gave an example of that. And they gave why, a bit of why and a bit of academic justification. You can use first person throughout your task, but especially it would be here in your reflective. I would do this. Why I would do this. So the whole class, have we answered future teaching? Yep. And I suppose this may, can I say, well, again, I'm being critical here. Some of these things have been mixed in together. I would really strongly recommend that you use the same area here, same sub-descriptor in your organisation. However, in saying that, have they covered all these things? Have they talked about the scope and sufficiency of data? Have they talked about informing next step teaching? Yes. Have they described the difference between planned and enacted teaching and why? Well, they have. They said, this. I did this and found this out, therefore I did it, one of those things. Did they use student data to modify their progress? Yes, they had examples of that. And they put themselves in the heading next step teaching about what they do in the future. So I think this could be slightly better organised to answer the criteria more succinctly and directly, but it has all the elements through there. So pause, have a look at your sample or other samples you're reviewing to see whether it matches. Section number 5. Now, before I go to the rubric, this is putting the whole, what I call the meta-narrative together. The meta-narrative being data, analysis, planning and teaching, and impact. So I want to see that whole story being told throughout this section. You're putting it all together and making a determination at the end, the impact, was it effective or not? Now, if we go to the rubric, it uses these terms. So let's unpack what the terms are. And at first thing it says through 2 scenarios. Now the booklet tells you that the scenario is one of those is a whole class, and others it could be a group of students or your focus students. Most people use focus students. They select a focus student or 2 focus students to go through. So you have to connect your theory, what you did, which is your planning and teaching, and a body of evidence evidenced it, and evaluate was it effective and was it demonstrate impact. The last one, let's leave for the side a little bit, how they were not in progressing the student learning and why. And that's really a whole class sort of discussion. But your scenarios this is your data narrative. Data, analysis, planning and teaching, impact. Here. So your scenarios are your whole class and your focus, a couple of your focus students. So let's have a look at the whole class. So initial data. And I described to you in other places that you have what I call a before and after commentary on where the students were pre-test versus summative test. So this is where they were initially. And that's pulling from section number 1. Your data. Here's data, work sample data, where they were. This is what I did. I did a remediation lesson. I did this. I did this, and I used these areas. I'm expecting you to pull through some of your teaching strategies, and we notice we've seen that resource before as a scaffolded task. And after this is the graduate, came under the graduate responsibility model. So you're going to pick 1 or 2 of your key strategies that you've talked about in section number 2 and apply it in this plan and teaching section here. And they've done that. And they've talked about the challenges of that. So I'm hearing analysis for that. Am I seeing justification and pedagogical reasoning? I am. So here's the strategies, here's my resources I used. And you notice these are not unfamiliar resources, the resources I've already mentioned previously. And this was the outcome demonstrating impact. This is where it landed now. And this is the summative task. So that's your before, this is now your after. And they talked more critically about was it effective, and they said here's some interesting information that added to that. So did they show me that story through the whole class? Did they give me data? Okay, whoop, that's right here. Yes, data, response, planning and teaching, response. This is how I utilised it. Here's my key strategies and resources and tools I used. And this, here again, probably could be a little bit more condensed. And this is the outcome at the end, impact. In final assessment, barriers. Now you could also include here a table of results as another overall impact. Now the second one, the second scenario is the individual focused student. Again, data, through data along the way, strategies that you wanted to use, resources that you use, and pick a different strategy. Be strategic about how you're expressing it this way. Don't use the same strategy suite in the whole class as you might want to be doing for your focus students. There might be overlap, but don't use them exactly the same. Scaffolding, barriers that hindered learning through that. So in this section, I think, have they demonstrated? Yes, but I think this is probably the weaker section because it has demonstrated impact, but I would like to see in the same way an echo of what was at the beginning. In the beginning, if I just take you right there, the beginning was tables of information about the students here. Now you can do the same. What was your summative task look like? Where were they? So I think this one has been met, but not as strongly as met as others. And I find that that's the case with many samples, that we have to then produce the last point in the criteria that was examine and discuss were effective and not effective. So it was talked about inhibiting learning and why. That was covering that. But did I have an overall impact learning? I think data tables pulled from your summative assessment, which you've already described in section number 3, to pull that through might be an addition. But overall, they're met in all areas and strongly met in sections 1, 2, 3 and 4.